Good morning, church. Very often, a good story begins with bad news. I said every story, but most stories, most good stories begin with bad news. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a story to tell. For example, once upon a time, there was someone who lived a perfectly comfortable life, and no misfortune ever came to them until they died surrounded by family at the age of 102. Now, that's the end. That's not a bad story, but not one that's likely to get published or adapted into a movie. It's not really a story worth telling because it's not a realistic one that we can relate to. Because every single one of us has received bad news. There are conflicts in our stories. Sometimes adversity, sometimes an adversary. Bad news comes in a lot of forms, and sometimes it downpours on us. The key to a good story, then, whether it's about a wizard and a princess or the autobiography of a president, is demonstrating how that conflict and adversity is overcome. A good story begins with bad news and is then about how the protagonist responds to it. For the next few weeks, we'll be looking at a story that has been handed down from generation to generation for over 3,000 years. That's how good of a story it is. And like many good stories, it begins with bad news. Famine and death, heartbreak and loneliness, the loss of hope and of dreams of the future. This is the story of Ruth. And it is a story of redemption. The Book of Ruth has been a favorite of many people for centuries, thousands of years now. It isn't very long. Modern Bibles divide it into 4 chapters with about 80 verses total. It's sandwiched between the lengthier books of Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel. And if you're flipping through your print Bibles, it's easy to miss. Using your table of contents, that's okay. But it's placed there among Judges and Samuel because of its historical setting. But in the Hebrew Bible that most Jews use, it's placed in the category of wisdom literature after the book of Proverbs, making Ruth a perfect example of Proverbs 31's a woman of valor. But there have been some people over the years who have wondered if Ruth should be included in the Bible at all. For them, this is a nice story, and Ruth is a good example, but there's hardly any mention of God at all. Just a couple of passing references. But if anyone were to argue that God is not present in this story, I would very much argue against them, as would most Jews and Christians today. Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David, and therefore one of Jesus' ancestors, which Matthew's genealogy notes. This story was important to Jesus, and it's important to us. And looking at this story, God is everywhere. So much so that I've heard this referred to as the Gospel of Ruth. While it begins with bad news, it proclaims good news. And here's how it begins in chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, Both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on a road that would take them back on the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." And at this, they wept aloud again. And then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So begins the book of Ruth. What is not just Ruth's story. Ruth is the Proverbs 31 woman, the exemplary paradigm of faithfulness, not just to women, but to men. A reflection of God's faithful love that we will see weaved throughout this entire story. Even if that isn't made explicitly clear, it is there. This is a story about faithful loving kindness, which in Hebrew is the word hesed, and is all over the Old Testament. For hesed is the story of God and humanity. But this is also Naomi's story, for which I am very grateful, because often I feel more like a Naomi than a Ruth. And perhaps you do too. And that is okay. We'll be talking about Ruth for the next 3 weeks, but I want to consider Naomi today. First off, I want to note that it's really amazing that we have this story at all. The Bible is filled with stories of amazing women, as is other examples in ancient literature, but it is very rare that women were the main protagonists of a story. And from the opening verses, it makes it seem like this was going to be another story like all the others from that time era, that this would be about Elimelech and his sons, Mahlon and Chilion. These were men from Bethlehem. And that town had something of a reputation, didn't it? David was a man from Bethlehem, and so was Jesus. But just a few verses into the story, there's this unexpected twist, and these men from Bethlehem suddenly die, leaving the focus of the story on the women that they left behind. Naomi and Ruth were widows, now in a time and place where it was very dangerous to be a widow. They were already struggling to find food in the midst of famine, but with the loss of the men in their lives, they were even more vulnerable and at risk, because they lived in a culture where the value of women was based on their relationships with men. When without husbands and without sons, they were seen as worthless. And this should have been the end of the story for them. But it wasn't. This was just the beginning. But when your story begins with such bad news, it's hard to want to even continue. Where do you go from there? You go home. There was nothing left in Moab for Naomi. The only reason that her family went there was out of desperation anyway. Moab had a terrible reputation, especially among the people of Israel. The Moabites were seen as dangerous, violent barbarians whose conflicts with Israel go back to Genesis. In fact, Deuteronomy 23 says, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt." Moab had never shown hospitality in the past. So Naomi and her family had to be awfully desperate to go to Moab for help. But Naomi's family, they did. They found food there. Their sons found wives. Naomi lived there for many years. Not prospering, but they were getting by, even if it didn't last. After burying her husband and her sons in that foreign land, Naomi made her way back to Bethlehem, having heard that the famine was over there. But even if it weren't, what else was she going to do? In her grief and with her life in shambles, Naomi went home. And surprisingly, her daughters-in-law did too. And we don't know how long they journeyed on the road to Judah before Naomi stopped and realized that Judah wasn't home for them. "Go home," she told them. She had nothing to offer them. She could not provide for them, so she told them, "Find another husband to take care of you." She wasn't going to have any more sons anytime soon. Ruth and Orpah were still young. They had futures and possibilities ahead of them, but not her. Not Naomi. And the young women wept loudly in their shared pain because they had all suffered together so far. Their story was just beginning, but they had already been through so much. How could they just leave her? It was a difficult decision, but Orpah chose to go back to her village, and no one can blame her for that. But Ruth made that astounding choice to go with Naomi. "Where you go, I will go." Naomi couldn't believe her, kept on urging her to go home until she realized that Ruth wasn't going anywhere unless it was with her. Ruth's faithfulness was relentless, and nothing, not even death, would stop her. So Naomi went home, and Ruth, the Moabite widow, went with her. Would Ruth find a future there in Bethlehem? It was a risk, especially considering what the law of Moses said about Moabites. But life in Israel was kinder to widows, thanks to the law of Moses, which commanded that widows and foreigners be provided for and taken care of. Did Ruth being with Naomi make things better for Naomi? Honestly, not really. Because there's not much that would. Sure, she wasn't alone, but she was still devastated. Returning to Bethlehem after decades away, the townspeople couldn't believe their eyes that it was Naomi walking into town. They thought they would never see her again. They could barely recognize her. Life hadn't been kind to her, and it likely showed. Life had been hard and unfair, and Naomi didn't have the emotional energy to pretend like it had been anything but awful. Don't call me Naomi. Don't call me blessed. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. Call me empty. Call me abandoned by God, because that is how I feel, and that is what I am. When someone is wounded and hurting from trauma and grief, sometimes it's hard for those around to help them. We have to recognize that they cannot simply be fixed. And as amazing as what Ruth had said to her was, Naomi was still struggling with her value and self-worth. She probably didn't think that she was worthy of Ruth's faithful love, much less God's faithful love. She didn't deserve Hesed, and she didn't want it. She needed to vent and lament and express how she felt and how angry and hurt she was and just how really awful life had been for her. She didn't need anyone to tell her that everything was going to get better eventually, or that everything happens for a reason, or that she didn't dare say those things about God. She just needed someone to listen to her. And when people are hurting, that's often the best thing you can do. Be present and mourn and listen. And for Naomi, right next to her mourning and listening and never once leaving her side was Ruth. Ruth knew the pain too. She wasn't going to try to push the hurt away or pretend that it didn't exist. She wasn't uncomfortable with Naomi's brutal honesty. Naomi was just saying things out loud that Ruth likely felt too. But in her continuing presence, without having to say a whisper of a word, Ruth was showing Naomi that she was worthy of love, worthy of faithfulness, worthy of Hesed. And in that sacred presence of a shoulder soaked with tears, there we find God. Ruth was a Moabite. She had just declared her conversion to the God that Naomi served and worshipped, but already through Ruth's faithful love, she was demonstrating God's faithful love. In the ministry of presence, in those quiet moments, it may be difficult to hear at first, but eventually we can begin to hear the whisper of God telling us, you are worthy. You are loved. I hear you. I see you. I know the pain. I am not angry with you. I have not abandoned you. Where you go, I will go. I will not leave your side today, and I will not leave your side tomorrow. I am with you always. That is Naomi's story. It began with bad news, but it didn't end there. Soon, the harvest was beginning. And we'll see how this unfolds for her in the next few weeks. But there are no divine actions, miracles in the book of Ruth. God doesn't show up in a cloud or a burning bush. Throughout this story, God doesn't say a single thing. But God is present. God is present in Ruth's story, in Naomi's story, and God is present in your story too. You are not alone. God's faithful love is present with us too, and it will never, ever leave us. For this is the gospel we are preaching and the good news we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. May the world hear it and see it and know it, because we need it. I know a lot of people who feel a lot like Naomi, or have felt like her, or will feel like her. What do we do when bad news hits us? I imagine that Ruth wanted to push Naomi, that Naomi wanted to push Ruth away, just to shut her out. But she didn't. She allowed Ruth to be present with her, to minister to her with her presence. And I pray that the same is true for our community. May we minister to one another and allow each other to minister to us, to let each other in when the pain of the world is great. Our church is blessed to be there for one another. But we also have specially trained Stephen ministers who are there to listen and care for people who are in crisis. And I know in the moment it may be hard to accept that help, but I encourage you, let us minister to you. Whether it's a Stephen minister, a shepherd, me or Sam or whoever it might be, let us be present with one another through all that we face together. And in all things, may God receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.